Hello, everybody. We are the students of Willy Brandt School, and welcome to our podcast through the lens of the UN. In a short while, you will listen to the most pressuring issues around the world from the United Nations perspective.
Today, let's ask, how is the coronavirus pandemic impacting women and girls?
During the pandemic, especially the lockdown, this violence was on an increase. It rose up so much. I work as a human rights activist by profession, and then we realized that during the pandemic, the rate of complaints rose to like times three. The rate of domestic violence, of rape, of harassment, of assault, of battery, it was sickening.
Imagine something as simple as a pad. It was very difficult to get. I was on my period. I couldn't get a pad because everywhere was closed. The pharmacies were barely open. The ones that were open, the queue. You could queue for 5 hours and still not get a chance to get in.
Due to the pandemic, more women and girls in my community have been subjected to gender-based violence. This happens because they find themselves in a restricted space with their abusers. There are no way for them to find alternative of or a safe place from their abusers.
Though I was at home, I had to do all the housework while my brothers were at home doing nothing, and I still had to work from home and then still do my house chores while they did nothing.
Those were real voices of women and girls that have been impacted by this pandemic. The coronavirus pandemic is undoubtedly affecting women and girls disproportionately and worsening existing inequalities.
Women's jobs are 1.8 times more vulnerable to this COVID crisis than men's jobs. Already, women accounted for more than half of the overall job losses as of May last year. And this is important to know because women and girls reinvest 90% of their income into their families compared to about 30 to 40% for men.
But it's not just about jobs and income. Even in education, there's an inequality between boys and girls in accessing school, and at the peak of the pandemic, about 1.6 billion children were out of school. Let's think about it. Girls being out of school increases their exposure to forced marriage, female genital mutilation, child labor, and trafficking.
Furthermore, women and girls are more exposed to this virus as caregivers. We have seen an increase in incidences of gender based violence as a result of the lockdown. So, whatever COVID plan or response strategy we talk about, we should consider the dynamics of inequality and the impact of women and girls. I bet we can no longer shy away from these issues during this pandemic.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast, Through the Lens. Today, we will be talking about how to strengthen national and international response to the impact of coronavirus disease on women and girls. My name is Damilola Adeniran, and with me,
Gifting Amitebri.
and together we'll be analyzing this topic through the lens of the UN. We will go a bit into some of this impact. We will also touch on what the response strategy should be and how the UN can play a role in addressing these issues. As we know, the United Nations is the number one organization in the world that handles issues that cannot be resolved by one country acting independently. So, Gifty, what can you tell us about the UN's resolution on this matter?
So, the UN resolution on this matter, strengthening national and international rapid response to the impact of the coronavirus disease on women and girls, was initially drafted on 12 October 2020.
Oh, which countries were at the forefront of pushing this resolution?
Countries from Africa and Asia played a leading role with Algeria, China, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Zambia as the lead sponsors. It was actually one of the two resolutions that were presented to the third committee relating to the central theme, advancement of women and girls in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Interesting. Tell us more.
Okay, so the representative of Egypt presented a revised version of the first draft on behalf of the lead sponsors. The representative intimated that the new document highlights the devastating impact of the pandemic and the roles played by developing countries in pursuing a common goal of strengthening responses to the pandemic. This first draft was revised following 3 weeks of six informal meetings, where comments and suggestions for amendments were all considered and accordingly addressed.
So, was this just about developing countries from Africa and Asia?
No, not at all. Actually, the United States proposed three additional amendments to the revised draft resolution, which came after these informal meetings and revisions were done, and which was a bit of a surprise. Some countries also expressed regret at the proliferation of resolutions on the same topic, with some suggesting a single robust resolution on the theme. Again, the representatives of various countries called for a more human rights centered approach in the resolutions. An obvious pointer to the acceptance of the first proposed amendment to the revised draft resolution by the United States.
Cool. So, I'm aware that after a series of deliberations and explanations of the positions of representatives present, the resolution was eventually adopted by consensus.
Yeah, that's actually true. The resolution essentially highlights the challenges that women are facing within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and how these issues are further widening the existing inequality gaps in the society. Specifically, the issues of threats to access to sexual, reproductive, and general health care services and the disproportionate assumption of unpaid care duties by women and girls are outlined. Additionally, the negative socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic vis-à-vis the progress made over the years in the area of women empowerment were also highlighted. The resolution also expresses deep concern for the disproportionate effects that the school closures have had on girls, as well as the exacerbation of the problem of gender based violence and domestic violence due to the lockdowns that the current pandemic has necessitated.
A lot of negative impacts there. I'm wondering what the UN resolution proposed as the way forward.
Well, the resolution made a clarion call to governments, policymakers, and stakeholders to ensure that policy strategies and response measures to address the coronavirus are quote unquote people centered, gender sensitive, context specific, whole of government and whole of society, and prevention oriented, whilst considering the direct and indirect impact on women and girls in the immediate and long term. Also, member states are encouraged to ensure the inclusion of women and their full, equal, and meaningful participation in the decision making processes regarding the formulation and implementation of these response strategies. Calls are also made for the strengthening of international and multilateral cooperation among member states to ensure concerted efforts in responding appropriately to the COVID-19 pandemic.
So, the UN is calling on member states to do this and that. Shouldn't some UN institutions also, take responsibility in this matter?
Yeah, I think you're right, Dami. The UN women have actually set a commendable pace in ensuring that a lot of recommendations outlined in this resolution are actually being implemented in the UN projects that are aimed at addressing the current pandemic. The recently released report on the UN global response to COVID-19, for example, highlights, among other actions, the timely issuance of a global call to action by the entity's executive director and the 10-point checklist for governance by her deputy in a bid to raise awareness on the necessity of taking gender perspectives into consideration in finding a global response to the pandemic. UN Women has been trying to ensure that thematic responses to the pandemic by the UN focus strongly on gender disparities. Also, we can mention contributions to the UN framework for immediate socio-economic response to COVID-19, which forms the basis for the United Nations Response and Recovery Fund for COVID-19, the Gender Monitor, and the COVID-19 Global Gender Response Tracker, among many numerous other policy briefs, executive articles, and global campaigns. By this and many other examples, I think the UN has proven to member states and governments the feasibility of ensuring gender sensitivity in the formulation and implementation of response plans and policies. Worthy of mention again is the demonstrated willingness of the UN to assist member states in achieving this.
That is interesting. But I think it is important to keep in mind that the UN is burdened with a myriad of other equally pressing and important resolutions and mandates that may as well put a strain on the organization's human, logistical, and financial resources. For example, recent reports have detailed how the UN had to cut down on certain humanitarian activities due to lack of funds. Furthermore, it is important to note that even though resolutions are considered to be binding on all members, the pace and extent of compliance lies largely on governments and stakeholders, which may stall efforts towards global change.
That's very true. I believe that we all have a responsibility as global citizens to push this agenda in our own small ways in order to ensure that the world becomes a better place, not only for women and girls, but for humanity at large.
That is totally true, Gifty. That is why we are also doing our bits through this podcast, and our main focus today is highlighting how COVID 19 is impacting women and girls and the need to build back differently with a gender sensitive approach that meets the needs of women and girls and ensures their participation in the response and recovery process. So, to start off, I would like to recollect what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres had to say on this issue during the launch of a report that shows how COVID 19 can undo the little progress that has been recorded on gender equality and women's rights. He said, and I quote, nearly 60% of women around the world work in the informal economy, earning less, saving less, and at greater risk of falling into poverty. As markets fall and businesses close, millions of women's jobs have disappeared. At the same time as they are losing paid employment, women's unpaid care work has increased exponentially as a result of school closures and the increased needs of older people. These currents are combining as never before to defeat women's rights and deny women's opportunities. Gender equality and women's rights are essential to getting through this pandemic together. Progress lost takes years to regain. Teenage girls out of school may never return. Gifty, what are your thoughts on the comments made by the UN Secretary General?
Well, I think he perfectly sums up everything. The challenges of COVID are real, and for women, they are all the more pronounced because of the gender disparities we've had to deal with even before the pandemic.
True. That is why today on the show, we are saying that the first step is to include women as we try to solve these problems and recover from the pandemic. The UN Secretary General agrees. He continued his speech by saying, I urge governments to put women and girls at the center of their efforts to recover from COVID 19. That starts with women as leaders with equal representation and decision making power. And he also said, gender equality and women's rights are essential to getting through this pandemic together, to recovering faster, and to building a better future for everyone.
Hmm, gender equality. But there's even no equality in the response. It's a sad reality that men outnumber women 3 to 1 across COVID 19 government task forces around the world, according to the United Nations Development Programme, UN Women, and the Gender Inequality Research Lab at the University of Pittsburgh. Also, data from the COVID 19 Global Gender Response Tracker showed that after 1 year of the pandemic, women only made up about 24% of members among 225 COVID 19 task forces in 137 countries, as 26 countries had no women at all represented.
Hmm. I think such disproportionate representation will only negatively impede the recovery of women and girls from the pandemic. The UN must now work harder to ensure that specific needs of women and girls are incorporated into national and international policies that are being formulated in response to the pandemic. This will ensure that inequalities are not widened further. Gifty, what do you think?
Well, I agree. I think more women should be included at the decision making table to ensure that these policies, strategies, and responses serve their interests as much as possible and to secure their development and empowerment even after the pandemic. COVID has indeed forced the world to speak and move with one voice and accord as we seek to address several issues such as vaccines and rebuilding economies. However, it is my opinion that we must also maximize this opportunity to push for the inclusion of women and girls' rights in the response to COVID. There's a lot of momentum for global cooperation during this pandemic, and we must not allow it to waste. Rather, we must use it as a tool to get a better deal for women and girls.
So, we know that around 70% of frontline health workers that are fighting this virus around the world are women. On the podcast today, we have one of such women, Dr. Christabel Ngwashi, who has been part of the frontline health workers in Cameroon.
Dr. Ngwashi is a medical doctor with experience providing healthcare in Cameroon, with particular focus on maternal, adolescent, reproductive, and child health care. She is the founder of More Than Just an MD Health, a platform which uses storytelling to improve health literacy and patient centered care via health communication on multiple platforms like social media, radio, and television. She has recorded global impacts by using digital technology for health promotion and was described as the 2020 Tech Women Emerging Leader by the US Department of State for Cultural Affairs.
Dr. Ngwashi is also an award winning writer with focus on issues which directly influence social determinants of health. She was declared a Youth Transforming Africa after emerging as country winner of the World Bank Group 2019 Blog for Deaf competition. Actually, I also won the same competition and met our guest today for the first time at the awards ceremony in the US. Her dedication to improving the health component of human capital development has been demonstrated by her active participation in a number of panel discussions with global policymakers, which paved the way for investment in African health systems.
For instance, she participated in the 2020 World Bank Spring meetings, where she shared with policymakers her experiences working in the COVID-19 front lines and how we can prepare for a resilient recovery. Also, she was interviewed by the International Labour Organization to give her opinions on how the pandemic can be better handled. Recently, she organized an event in partnership with the World Bank with youth leaders on how to engage them in good governance and transparency in the context of COVID-19 management.
It is really nice to have you on the show today, Dr. Christabel Ngwashi. First question: how would you compare your daily life and routine before and then during this pandemic?
First, I would say with my general life that's out of work, it's really reduced my social interactions with friends and other colleagues because we can't sit together very closely due to the social distancing rules that have been put in place. And then secondly, at work, I have to put on protective equipment like my mask, my gown, and all of that, which of course reduces that interaction with your patient, especially with a mask. The patient cannot see or smile, and that tends to strain the patient-doctor relationship. So I would say the patient-doctor relationship has really been strained as a result of the fact that that facial interaction between myself and my patients has really reduced as a result of the mask I have to put on. And then also with interactions with other people, be it out of the hospital or in the hospital, or my communication with my community, especially now when I have to talk about vaccines. Before, if I had to talk about vaccines, people really didn't have a problem with it. Now, when you talk about vaccines, especially with all the misinformation around COVID 19 vaccination, people tend to snub you and all of that. So it's changed a lot of things in my daily life, both at work, my social interactions, and my interactions in the community.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ngwashi. So, how would you say COVID has impacted you as a female frontliner during this pandemic?
First, when the pandemic just started, it took a toll on my mental health because I suffered a number of anxiety attacks or panic attacks, especially at the beginning when I got news of healthcare providers dying in the Western world. So watching the news every day was really traumatizing to me, and I was just like, so one day I'm just going to wake up, go to work, and not come back because I have COVID, and then I may eventually die. So it took a toll on my mental health. And also, a lot of my other female colleagues could relate to it because it wasn't easy. They needed to invite therapists to come and tell us how to take care of ourselves and all of that. And then, in addition, we as females, we have specific healthcare needs. Menstrual hygiene, sexual and reproductive health needs, and all of that. So sometimes when you're in the hospital as a female and you have your colleague who say is down with COVID and is on isolation, that means that we have to cover up for that colleague. So sometimes you get to spend 2, 3 days in the hospital, and it becomes really difficult to take care of those specific healthcare needs when you're in the hospital milieu. So all of that just plays on you as a female, and it was difficult to manage. But we have to find a way to go about that.
Yeah, thanks. So now let's get into this a bit more seriously. And my question is, why is it necessary to talk about the impacts of COVID on women and girls?
It's important because, first, women and girls are already vulnerable. They're a vulnerable set of people, be it in conflict and then now the pandemic. Because I practice in an area which is hit by conflict, and then now the pandemic is adding to it. That so you have this set of people being vulnerable to two problems facing them directly. And then you see that when people are sick, family members are sick of, say, COVID 19, most times you see people taking care of them in the hospital are either their mothers, their wives, or their sisters. They're generally females. So it means that it exposes them more to the virus, and it exposes them more to that, it increases their risk of getting the virus because they're in the hospital either taking care of family members or taking care of themselves. And then also you have, when coming back to still specific healthcare needs of women and girls, like for example, you have women who get pregnant, they need to come to the hospital for the antenatal clinic. And coming to the hospital, that means that it increases their risk of contracting the coronavirus disease. Therefore, it's important that we have to talk about it because they have a double risk. They are already vulnerable. And then there are not policies or particular, how will I put this? There are not particular policies that covers them, that actually protects them from this risk. So it's important we talk about it because we know that if they are vulnerable, then we have to ensure that there are policies or there are particular rules that ensures that it protects this vulnerable group of people.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's quite interesting. The next question has been partly answered in your previous answer, but we still want to know, are there any more health impacts that this has on women and girls in particular?
Sure, there are. Because, for example, I am the coordinator for the maternal and child health program in my hospital. And during the COVID 19 pandemic, we got to realize that there was a drop in the number of women coming for antenatal and the number of children coming to the hospital for vaccination. So, in addition to that, I live in a conflict area, girls are out of school, and there's an increased rate of teenage pregnancies, abortions, and all of that. So, you see that in the midst of all of this, and COVID 19 pandemic is straining the healthcare system, making it difficult for these women and girls to access the specific healthcare needs that they actually need to access. So when we during the COVID-19 pandemic, as a result of this shortage in healthcare services, you have a number of women who could not have access to antenatal services, could not have access to licensed healthcare providers to either conduct deliveries or even to vaccination, because vaccines have to be preserved at a particular temperature. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has strained that preservation, that's the vaccine cold chain, for the storage of vaccines. So also you have children not having access to vaccines, women and girls not having access to specific healthcare needs. Even women who need family planning and all of that, they don't have access because the healthcare system is overburdened as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this particular group of people are specifically affected because of their healthcare needs, which needs particular attention. And in the absence of policies that actually ensures that they are protected and covered, you cannot actually provide those healthcare services, especially when we have priority changes. Because I'm sure you realize that during this COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of priorities in healthcare system changed. There was more, a lot of attention was paid towards providing oxygen, isolation units, and all of that. Not like the other parts of healthcare were neglected, but a lot of attention was given towards the danger at hand, which was the COVID-19 pandemic. So with that attention given to that particular, to the COVID-19 pandemic, it became difficult to actually balance the attention given to those specific healthcare needs of women and girls. So, of course, provision of healthcare services to women and girls had to suffer, even though we tried balancing it. But it's important that we talk about these health impacts so that even in the future, as we plan resilient recovery, as countries are planning for their recovery and preparedness for any future pandemics, if it happens, it's important that we take into consideration all of these specific healthcare needs, such that even if a pandemic hits, the other healthcare needs of the vulnerable population doesn't suffer.
Thank you very much. That's really, really insightful. And we're just about rounding up this interview segment. But I want to ask, what should be the response to the pandemic, to ensure that women and girls are protected? And what should be the role of women in this response?
Very important. I think I'll start from your second question and then come to the first. The first thing in planning our recovery or in planning how to strengthen our healthcare systems is to involve more women in the policy making process. Because when we involve more women in the policy making process, we are the women, we understand the problems we face, we understand our specific healthcare needs. So, who else is better off to talk about provision of our healthcare needs than us? You understand? And also, research has shown that women in healthcare, administrative, and policy making positions tend to it tends to make it diversified. It makes the policies diversified. And when the policies are diversified, it covers even women's needs, children's needs, because one way or the other, women are directly involved in the care of children. Sometimes they are even more involved in the care of children. So when you involve more women in policy making, it doesn't just imply to them. That's they don't just craft policies that will affect just women. It gets to affect even children. And then considering the fact that what women need as healthcare is what men also need, even though men may have specific healthcare needs, but particularly what women actually need as healthcare can also be applied to men. So you see that when we involve more women in policy making, it tends to translate to strengthen the healthcare system to provide healthcare needs not just for women, but for children and even men. Therefore, it means that if women are involved in policy making, we can actually come up with policies that covers for healthcare for everybody, which puts us closer towards attaining the universal healthcare coverage goals. And then coming to your second question about how can we plan for resilient recovery or how can we plan for a recovery, it's important that in addition to involving women, we actually have to ensure that we do a partnership. We have to maximize partnership, not just between the government, but especially public-private partnerships. Because when you talk about supply of vaccines, supply of protective equipment, supply of things that are needed to improve the healthcare system, sometimes you have private partners that have to supply this equipment. So if we strengthen private-public partnerships, it's going to be a win-win for both parties, and of course, the communities are going to benefit from this. And then secondly, we need to ensure that we prioritize preventive, community, and patient-centered care. I'm sure you've seen that during the pandemic, a lot of people were talking about self-care, we're talking about boosting their immunity. And I'm sure a lot of people have learned the importance of preventive healthcare during this pandemic. So it's important that in preparing for our recovery, we actually ensure that we prioritize community care. Let people be involved in their own care. Like we're talking about vaccines and all of that, vaccine hesitancy. We need to ensure that health communication is given right down to the last person in the community. and not just to people right up there. We have to ensure that we communicate in the language that the least person actually understands so that it increases the vaccine coverage and it takes us closer to getting out of this pandemic. And then, thirdly, we have to ensure that we craft sustainable financing models to ensure that people are actually covered financially. Because according to the World Bank, we realize that a lot of poor people, as a result of healthcare bills, they were pushed further into poverty because they have to use money for basic needs at home to pay for their healthcare bills, for the healthcare bills. Sorry. So with the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of people lost their source of livelihood, and so there was some kind of shortage of income. So imagine that you still have to use that shortage of income to pay for healthcare, and that means that you're going to fulfill basic needs like food, shelter, and all of that. And then that puts us in a vicious circle of poverty, of malnutrition, because people have to forfeit food in order to pay for the healthcare bills. So, in planning for a recovery, we have to ensure that we have sustainable financing models that actually protects the vulnerable and the poor, especially women and children who actually don't have access to income generating assets or to income generating jobs. Because the thing is, most people who lost their jobs during this pandemic, most of them were women. So you see that when we are talking about policies, it should be able to cover women both medically, financially, and socially.
Thank you so much, Dr. Christabel Ngwashi. It has been so interesting to get your thoughts on this really important issue. Thank you so much for your time and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Now we are rounding up our discussion. So, Gifty, what are your final thoughts on what the UN can do? Or, better still, what should the UN do to strengthen the response to the impact of COVID-19 on women and girls?
Well, I think the UN must seek ways to ensure crucial engagement of stakeholders identified in this resolution on this matter, including non-governmental organizations and women and community-based organizations, youth-led and girl-led organizations, and women peace builders in ensuring their inputs into COVID-19 response and recovery mechanisms nationally and internationally. Women must also be consulted at all levels. Women's organizations that are in the front line in the fight against the pandemic must be provided with support to better meet the needs of women and girls, such as in the areas of sexual and reproductive health. So, what are your thoughts, Dami?
I think the UN must go a step further and push member countries to modify social protection mechanisms to better support women through and beyond this pandemic. For example, conditional cash transfer programs can be effective in targeting and putting money in women's hands to help them cope better with the pandemic. Also, there's no better time than now for the UN to get more concrete with ensuring the implementation of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action.
Yes, indeed. We've come to the end of the podcast today. Thank you for listening. Continue staying positive
and testing negative.
This has been Through the Lens. Have a great week.
And with that, we have come to the end of today's episode. A big thank you to all of the listeners. We will be back with another discussion next week. Please don't forget to subscribe and share. And for the curious ones, visit us at Willy Brandt's Bulletin page for more episodes.